My mother is obsessed with me using this name for my baby and having him born on a particular day, but after discovering the unpleasant reason my mother should obsess over a new marriage, I'm pregnant with my first child and it's a boy. My husband and I are excited, but my mother is behaving in a very strange and controlling way regarding my pregnancy. Some context. Since I was little, my mother was always a bit possessive of me and didn't like me spending much time with my dad, even though I loved being with him. I remember that every time we planned to do something together, my mom would invent some excuse to prevent it from happening. For example, once my dad and I were going to go fishing. It's not a typical activity for a girl, but I love spending time with my father because he was very fun, so going fishing was an activity I didn't mind. That's also why I know he'll be a great grandfather to my son when he's born. Anyway, we had planned the trip for weeks, bought all the necessary equipment, and were very excited. But the morning of the trip, suddenly my mother said she had to go to the doctor urgently and needed me to accompany her. She argued that she had been feeling unwell and needed a professional to check her as soon as possible. In the end, I had to cancel the trip with my dad to accompany her. It turned out she had nothing serious and we ended up postponing the father-daughter outing for another day. Although she also tried something that time too, but without luck, and we were able to spend the day together with my father. Another time we had planned to go to the zoo. It was something we had been talking about for a long time, as we both love animals. But just that day, my mom suddenly remembered she had to go to a work meeting. It was a matter of life and death according to her, and she needed me to stay home babysitting my little brother. I said we could take him with us, even though it was a father-daughter day, but she wouldn't have it. She said my brother, being so young, could catch something from being around so many animals. So once again I had to cancel my plans with Dad that day. And although she tried something similar for us to babysit my brother the next time we tried to go, her excuse didn't work and we ended up going. But these situations were constantly repeated. She always found a way to interfere. Whether it was faking an illness, inventing a work emergency, or even throwing a jealous fit because I was spending time with my father. Which was strange because I also did things with her and altogether she just didn't like me spending time alone with my dad. So, little by little, I started spending less time with my dad since doing so was always a big drama for my mother. Now that I'm pregnant, her behavior has worsened. She gets angry every time my dad comes to visit me to see how I'm doing, and if I need anything. The other day my dad left work and came straight to my house to bring me some cravings I had. I had casually mentioned in a phone conversation that I was really craving strawberries with cream, something I used to eat a lot as a child with him. So after work, he stopped by a supermarket, bought the prettiest strawberries he could find, and brought them to my house with a tub of cream. We spent a while chatting and laughing while he prepared the strawberries for me like when I was little. When my mom found out, she called him furiously asking why he had taken so long to get home. Upon learning he was with me, she went crazy and told him to stop pampering me so much, that I was too old for those things and that it wasn't his obligation to be fulfilling my cravings. My dad was confused, as he had only wanted to have a nice gesture with me. Besides, the strawberries were simply a silly excuse to spend time at my house. I felt very bad that she treated him like that and apologized for my mother's behavior. But that's not all. Since I told her I was having a boy, she has been insisting that I give him a particular name that I don't like at all. It's a name that, while not super weird, is definitely not common and not to my liking. I don't understand why she has this obsession with that name, as it doesn't belong to anyone in my family, but she insists I use it for my baby. My husband doesn't like it either, and we're undecided between 3 other names that have passed the test of time. That is, names we've suggested as possibilities, but haven't found reasons yet not to use them. We were hoping that by now a couple of them would be eliminated and we'd finally be left with one. Anyway, I've tried to tell her that we've already chosen a name with my husband, even though it's not entirely true, and that it's not that one, but she keeps pushing the same thing. She says I'm ungrateful, that after everything she's done for me, the least I can do is give my son the name she wants. She's gone as far as telling me that if I don't give him that name, she'll stop talking to me. It's crazy. And as if that weren't enough, she also wants me to schedule my delivery for a specific date. I had chosen a date close to what the doctors gave me according to their estimates, but she doesn't like it and wants me to change it no matter what. She calls me constantly to insist on the topic, and even does it in our family chat. At first everyone laughed because they thought it was a joke. My brother put a bunch of crying laughing emojis, and my aunts commented things like, "What silly ideas you have." But when they saw she was serious they stopped commenting. In private, they've told me they find her behavior very strange. One of my aunts, the one I'm closest to, told me that my mom was just as intense when I was about to be born, trying to control everything. And that in the end I was born when and how I wanted, so I shouldn't worry too much. I've told her 1,000 times that I'm not going to do any of that. I don't like the name she chose, and the delivery date is set with the doctors, unless there's a complication or the delivery comes early. But she's still angry with me. telling me it's the least I could do for her after all the sacrifices she's made as a mother. As if carrying her grandchild in my womb for 9 months wasn't enough. She already had her chance to be a mother and make all those decisions. Now it's my turn. I tried to talk to her to understand where this need to control everything about my pregnancy comes from. I asked if maybe she was feeling like she was losing her place now that I was going to be a mom, or if there was something from her own experience with my grandmother that was affecting her. But she just got defensive and told me I was being very selfish by refusing to give her these small pleasures. My husband has tried to stay out of it to not cause me more stress, but he thinks my mother is being unreasonable and that we should stand firm in our decisions. He supports me unconditionally and reminds me that at the end of the day, this baby is ours and we are the ones who will make the decisions about his upbringing. Honestly, I don't know what else to do. I've tried to be understanding, to reason with her, to set firm boundaries, and nothing seems to work. She just gets more and more intense and manipulative. I'm afraid her obsession with the baby will get worse once he's born. I don't want to deprive my son of his grandmother, but I also can't allow this toxic behavior to continue. From what I've read in other posts, people here are very inclined to cut ties with family members. Do you think I should do that in my case? I would really appreciate your advice and opinions. This situation has me very stressed at a time when I should be enjoying my sweet weight. It's also necessary to ask, according to what I've read about the rules of this subreddit, am I the bad one for refusing to accept my mother's demands, or is my mother crazy as a goat? Update 1. I wanted to give you an update on my situation with my mother and her obsession with my baby's name and birth date. First of all, I want to thank everyone who took the time to read my story and offer me their advice and words of support. I felt very validated seeing that the vast majority agreed that I'm not the bad one for refusing my mother's irrational demands. Many mothers and even fathers in the comments emphasized that this is my baby and my husband's, and that we and only we have the right to choose his name. Reading their experiences dealing with meddling relatives during their pregnancies made me feel less alone in this situation. As one of you said, your womb, your baby, your rules. And I couldn't agree more. Speaking of the name, I think we finally have it. If you remember from my previous post, we had narrowed our list down to 3 finalist names. Well, in this last week, my husband and I continued debating the pros and cons of each, until there was a clear winner in our hearts. I won't say it for privacy reasons, but we're both happy with the choice. It's a name with a very special meaning for us. Now every time I talk to my belly, I call him by his name and I feel our connection growing stronger. I know it might sound silly, but before I felt a bit insecure as a future mom for not having a name for my baby at this stage of pregnancy. Like I felt I was missing that fundamental piece to feel complete in my maternal role. So having this issue resolved has given me great peace of mind. I even laugh remembering how worried I was about this, when in the end the perfect name came to us so naturally and at the right time. But well, not everything has been good news. My mother called again a few days ago, supposedly to talk about other topics, but as always she found a way to bring up the infamous name. She started with her typical speech about how I'm being an ungrateful and selfish daughter for not pleasing her in this, that after everything she's done for me the least I deserved was to choose the name of her first grandchild, blah blah blah. Honestly, I'm so tired of hearing the same arguments over and over again. But instead of exploding like on previous occasions, I armed myself with patience and tried to put into practice some of the advice you kindly gave me. In particular, I focused on establishing clear and immovable boundaries with her once and for all, ones that she couldn't jump over. I told her, with as much calm as I could muster, that if she wanted to call or spend time with me to talk about anything other than her demands regarding the baby, she was more than welcome to do so. That I valued our relationship and wanted to keep it healthy. However, I was also very firm in telling her that if she couldn't respect my decisions as a mother, then unfortunately I would have to choose to distance myself for my own well-being and that of my family. That it was up to her to decide what kind of grandmother she wanted to be. A loving and present one, or a conflictive and absent one. But that regardless of what she chose, my boundaries were not negotiable. To my surprise, she reacted relatively well at that moment. I say relatively because obviously she wasn't happy, but at least she didn't start yelling like other times. She just said something like, "Okay, I see there's no point in continuing to discuss this with you." And then she changed the subject. That said, since that call I haven't heard from her again. She hasn't contacted me or made any mention of the topic in our family chat. At first I was a bit worried, but then I realized it's probably her way of punishing me for not giving in to her whims. Like a kind of passive-aggressive silent treatment. And you know what? I'm fine with it. I prefer this silence 1,000 times over having to endure her constant harassment. Especially now in this last stretch of my pregnancy. The last thing I need is unnecessary stress and drama. My priority is to take care of myself physically and emotionally. Plus, I have the unconditional support of my wonderful husband, who has been my rock through all this mess. And the rest of my family who, although at first didn't fully understand the situation, are now 100% on my side. My aunts have even offered to organize a welcome party, since apparently my mother had told them she wasn't planning to do it as a protest. Finally, I just wanted to share these updates with you and express my gratitude again for this incredible community. Update 2. Some time has passed since my last update, but I wanted to share with you the latest developments in the saga of my mother and her obsession with my baby's name and birth date. But before that, I have to say that I'm a mom. My baby came into the world right on the date estimated by the doctors, not a day earlier or later. The delivery was intense but beautiful, and both the baby and I are healthy and happy. And yes, in case you're wondering, we kept the name that my husband and I had chosen. That name that we felt perfectly captured the essence of our son, and that had so much meaning for us, not the one my mother had chosen. During the last weeks of pregnancy, after that conversation where I set clear boundaries with my mother, things were relatively calm. She stayed in touch, but only to talk about other trivial topics, never mentioning the name or due date again. She even attended the welcome party organized by my aunts and behaved quite normally, as if nothing had happened. I remained cautious, but thought that maybe she had finally understood the message and was respecting my decisions. That's what I believed until the day of the birth. On the day of the birth, my parents came to the hospital to meet their grandson. Due to hospital protocols and because I was in a shared room, only one person could enter at a time. My mother immediately jumped up and said she would be the first. My husband and my father looked uncomfortable, but in the end my husband told her to go ahead. He stayed outside waiting with my dad. When my mother entered the room, at first everything seemed fine. She looked at the baby with adoration and expressed her happiness at being a grandmother. But then she started calling him by the name she wanted to give him, the one I had rejected so many times. With all the calm I could muster, which wasn't much considering I had just gone through childbirth, I reminded her that the baby's name was the one my husband and I had chosen, and I repeated it emphatically. But she just smiled condescendingly and said, "For me, his name will always be the one I chose, no matter what you say." Then she had the audacity to insinuate that, although he hadn't been born exactly on the date she suggested, they could celebrate his birthday on that day anyway, as if it were a special agreement between her and the baby, completely excluding my husband and me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything we had been through, all the conversations and established boundaries, she was still clinging to her delusions of control. I tried to reason once more, reminded her that we had already discussed this to exhaustion and implored her not to make things more difficult, to simply enjoy her grandson without conditions. But she wouldn't listen. Just at that moment, a nurse entered the room to check on the other patient. Taking advantage of her presence, I asked her to please escort my mother out of the room, or to call security if necessary. My mother took offense, started saying how could I treat her like this, that she was my mother and had every right to be there. But the nurse explained that she was complying with her patient's wishes, and proceeded to accompany her to the door. According to what my dad told me later, things outside the room were not pretty at all. My mother was complaining to the poor nurse, demanding to speak to a supervisor, claiming that they hadn't let her see her grandson enough. The nurse patiently repeated that she was just following my instructions as a patient. Eventually, my mother calmed down a bit, and my dad thought he could finally go in to meet his grandson. But no, my mother told him that if she couldn't see the baby, neither could he. Imagine trying to control even my father's interactions with his own grandson. Fortunately, my dad didn't let himself be manipulated. He firmly told her that he was going to come in to see me and the baby whether she liked it or not, and that if she had a problem with that, she could wait for him in the car. When my father finally entered the room, it was such a special moment. He was emotional to the point of tears, looking at his grandson with pure love and fascination. He told me he was proud of me and not to worry about anything, to focus on recovering and enjoying this new stage. His support meant the world to me at that moment. After my parents left, my husband was able to come in and be with me for a while alone. He told me more details of what had happened outside with my mother. In addition to what my dad had told me, it seems my mother was furious with everyone, with the hospital staff for kicking her out, with me for giving them the order, with my father for not taking her side, and even with my husband, although he hadn't even been present in the room during the incident. I guess by association for being on the enemy side, or for simply standing out there with her. It's been a week since we were discharged and we're adapting to our new life at home. My father came to visit us yesterday, and it was beautiful to see him interact with his grandson. But my mother hasn't shown up, hasn't called to ask how we are, nor has she shown interest in coming to meet the baby now that we're in a more private environment. And honestly, you know what? I think it's perfect this way. After everything that's happened, all the ways she's tried to sabotage this special moment with her obsessions and manipulations, I think a little distance is the healthiest thing right now. I don't know what will happen in the future, if at some point she'll come to her senses, and we'll be able to have a normal grandmother-grandson relationship. But for now, my priority is to take care of my son and my little family, To surround ourselves with people who love and respect us unconditionally. Sometimes I feel sad that things have come to this point with my mother, but then I look at my baby and feel an overwhelming peace and clarity. This is what matters. This is what I've fought for all these months. To protect this little being and welcome him into the world on my own terms, without giving in to emotional blackmail or others' expectations. Update 3. Here I am again, 2 weeks after my last update. These have been intense days, adapting to being a mother. I even have a post in a motherhood subreddit, which is not just for complaining about very crazy mothers. You'll understand why soon. But despite the exhaustion and the overwhelming life change, I can say I'm handling it pretty well. My little one is an angel at least most of the time, and each day I fall more in love with him. In these 2 weeks we've received many visitors. My father has come several times, always loaded with gifts and with a smile from ear to ear when he sees his grandson. You can tell he really enjoys being a grandfather. My husband's parents and siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, and even more distant relatives I haven't seen in years have also come. It's been comforting to feel the support and affection of family at this special time. But I'm not here to tell you about the guest list that has paraded through our living room. Today I want to tell you about a particular visit, one that brought unexpected revelations and has shaken my world to its foundations. It's about my mother's cousin, a woman I've always considered more of an aunt because of how close she is to my mom. When she asked if she could come to meet the baby, I must admit I had my doubts. For a moment I feared she might come as my mother's emissary to try to convince me again about the name and date. But I'm glad I gave her the benefit of the doubt and accepted her visit. We were chatting about a bit of everything, catching up on family and life in general. But at some point, inevitably, the topic of my mother and her obsession with controlling certain aspects of my pregnancy and childbirth came up. To my surprise, she had no idea what I was talking about. It turns out she's not in the family group chat where my mother had been expressing her suggestions, in quotes, so insistently. That chat is mostly for close family members. My mother's sisters, my father, my husband, and some of my direct cousins. But this cousin, being from a slightly more distant branch, wasn't aware of all the drama. So I told her everything. My mother's constant pressure to use the name she wanted, her insistence on scheduling my delivery on a specific date, the incident at the hospital when she tried to impose her will even after the baby was already born. My aunt listened attentively, with an increasingly worried expression. When I finished my story there was a moment of silence. Then with a sigh she said, "I think I know why your mother is so obsessed with that name and date." She told me a story that made my head spin. It turns out that the name and date my mother wanted to impose on my son correspond to an old love from her youth. A man with whom, according to her, my mother had an intense but brief relationship before meeting my father. Although it was something fleeting, it seems that my mother was deeply marked by this person, to the point of developing a kind of obsession that has endured all these years. I had never heard this man mentioned. I didn't even know my mother had had a significant relationship before my dad. I always saw them as the perfect couple, the predestined love story. But now, suddenly everything was wobbling. If my mother was so attached to her ex-boyfriend to the point of wanting to give his name to my son, what else didn't I know about her past? After my mom's cousin left, I felt lost. I didn't know what to do with this information, how to process it. Part of me wanted to call my mother and confront her directly, demand the truth. But another part was afraid of what I might discover. What if this ex-boyfriend turned out to be something more than that? That night, when I put the baby to bed, I found myself staring at him for a long time, looking for some sign in his features, something that would tell me my fears were unfounded. But how could I be sure? Suddenly, the idea of getting a DNA test started to run through my mind. Maybe it was the only way to dispel the doubts, to know once and for all if my father was really my biological father. When my husband joined me in the room, I couldn't contain my emotions anymore. I broke down crying and told him everything my mother's cousin had told me. He listened in silence, holding me tight. When I finished, he looked me in the eyes and said, "Love, I understand this is a shock and you must have 1,000 questions. But I want you to know that, whatever happens, I'm here with you. You're my wife, the mother of my child, and nothing is going to change that. If you need to seek answers, if you decide to get a DNA test or talk to your father, I'll support you in everything. But don't let this rob you of the joy of this moment. Our son loves you, I love you, and that's the most important thing. So that's all for now. I bid you farewell. Now I'm going to take the time to think about what to do, and what my next step will be." Update 4. After much reflection and talking with my husband, I decided I couldn't stay with the doubt. I needed answers. I needed to hear this man's version directly. So I asked my mother's cousin if she had any way to contact him. She didn't have a phone number, but it was easy to find his information on the internet thanks to the information my mother's cousin gave me. When he answered, I could immediately hear the confusion in his voice. I introduced myself, explained who I was and that I needed to talk to him about something important. There was silence on the other end of the line. followed by a "It's been years since I've heard from her." "Sure, tell me, how can I help you?" I took a deep breath and started telling him everything. My mother's strange behavior during my pregnancy, her insistence on using a certain name and date for my baby, the cousin's revelation about their past relationship. Finally, I got to the hardest part, asking if there was any possibility that I could be his daughter. Another silence, this time longer. I could hear his breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, he spoke. "I understand you must be going through a very confusing and painful time, but I want you to know that what I had with your mother was a brief relationship many, many years ago. We ended things long before she met your father, and we never resumed contact. I've always respected her marriage and her family. I have no reason to doubt that your father is your biological father, as your mother and I haven't seen each other in a long time. Still, I know I can't stay with the doubt. I've decided that I'm going to tell my father everything and suggest that we take a DNA test. I know it will be a difficult and painful conversation, but I feel it's necessary to be able to close this chapter and move forward. I can't help but feel a mix of conflicting emotions. On one hand, I'm grateful to have a husband who supports me unconditionally, and a healthy and beautiful baby. I'll be back when I've talked to my father and know more about all of this. Update 5. A month has passed since my last update, and it has been a month full of emotions and revelations. I know I left you with the uncertainty of my pending conversation with my father and the possibility of a DNA test. Well, I finally have some answers to share with you. Shortly after my call with my mother's ex-boyfriend, I gathered my courage and sat down with my dad to tell him everything. It was one of the most difficult conversations I've had in my life. My father was aware of the existence of this ex-boyfriend. It was true that it was a relationship my mother had before my parents started dating. However, my dad had no idea if they had been in contact all these years. He didn't know his name, much less his birthday, so it wasn't as if he had suspected anything when my mother started to become a bit intense about these things. When I mentioned the idea of getting a DNA test to dispel any doubts, my father agreed immediately. We decided that it was best to wait for the test results before confronting my mother. My father wanted to have all the facts clear before making any decisions on how to handle this situation. I agreed, although the wait seemed endless. During the following weeks, I tried to keep myself busy with my baby and my daily routine, but the uncertainty was always there. There were moments when I was tempted to make an update here to vent and seek your support, but in the end I decided to wait until I had the results. I didn't want to make an update with only half the information. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we received the DNA test results. And there it was, in black and white, a 99.99% probability that my father is, in fact, my biological father. I hugged my father tightly, and we both cried tears of happiness and relief. Despite all the pain and confusion of the past few weeks, this certainty was an invaluable gift. But our joy was overshadowed by the realization that we now had to confront my mother. My father has said that despite this positive result, it doesn't change the fact that my mother has been obsessed with him all this time. Even if I am their biological daughter, it doesn't mean they haven't been seeing each other all this time. So he's been thinking this past month about everything that's happened and believes that he's going to ask for a divorce anyway. I can't blame him for wanting to do it. Having suspicions that your partner has been unfaithful or doesn't want to be with you is not easy at all. Update 6. Finally, my parents have started the divorce process, and as you can imagine, it hasn't been pleasant at all. My mother blames me for all of this. She says I shouldn't have stuck my nose where it doesn't belong by contacting her ex-boyfriend and getting a DNA test. According to her, it was a very low act on my part and the reason why her marriage is falling apart. But that's not all. In a desperate attempt to deflect attention from her own actions, my mother has even insinuated that my husband should get a DNA test for our son, suggesting that maybe I've been unfaithful to him. Fortunately, my husband doesn't believe her manipulations. He fully trusts me in our love. In fact, his response to my mother was that only a cheater considers others to be cheaters too. I can't express how much his unwavering support means to me in the midst of all this chaos. In contrast, my father has been more present than ever. He comes to visit us regularly, enjoying every moment with his grandson. The other day he reminisced about our fishing trips when I was a child, and how he can't wait for my son to be old enough to continue that tradition. Despite the pain of his separation, he seems lighter, as if a great weight has been lifted off his shoulders. If there's a positive side to all of this, it's that my mother was already quite upset with me since I was discharged from the hospital. Her anger at being kicked out of my room at that time meant she hasn't tried to visit us all this time. And now with the divorce and our relationship more strained than ever, I hope she stays away for a good while.